To remind you, we're working on a very straightforward, simple kiss hat for adults, and we are now up to here. The ribbing is complete, and we are moving on to the main portion of the hat, which is all ordinary stocking stitch or knit stitches, so it will start to go faster. Our ribbing is complete. That's enough of it. And now we're going to review the knit stitch in some detail because that's what the rest of the hat consists of. Wherever the last stitch is, take the working yarn on the interior side of that pin. It's really just a spacer. Now outside around the next peg. I'm going to hold this at an odd angle. Lift the bottom loop over the top loop. Because I have a doubled yarn as my working yarn, it looks like 2 loops, but we count it as 1. Wrap, bottom over top. Now, I personally do very well wrapping the entire row, or at least the entire row up to a corner. People say that they have trouble with the loops sliding off. Do you see how my fingers are walking down the pegs and pins? That prevents it. So now I'm kind of in your way, sorry. I typically knit off the last stitch that I have wrapped. Now the others are all locked into position, and I find it's easy to go back and knit them over. There is nothing inherently superior about wrapping the whole row as I do, but you may want to try it because for me it makes it easier to get the stitches even. I am not a big fan of the idea that speed is of the essence, but even so, it feels good to make fast progress sometimes. And I make faster progress with less confusion and more even stitches, wrapping a whole side at once. If you don't, wrap stitch by stitch. There is no moral high ground here. Find what works for you. Now, as I knit, and I'm just going to continue to do it in various ways and try to keep the focus, I want to talk about the length. You will probably need 26 to 30 complete rounds of stockinette. Stockinette is all knit stitches. The reason for the range is twofold. Some adult heads are smaller than others. Women, on average, tend to enjoy about an 8-inch distance from the bottom of the head bottom of the hem to the top of the head at the crown. For men, the typical measurement is 9. This fabric is stretchy enough to accommodate most women and most men. It'll be looser on the smaller heads and snugger on the bigger heads, but it's pretty much okay for most adults. However, the more it is stretched out because the head is bigger around, as is true of larger men, and some women can have more and less hair as well as different size skulls. The more you stretch the fabric width-wise, that width comes from somewhere and it's borrowed from the length. So you will probably want between 8 and 9 inches of knitting, and you decide based on who you're knitting for. And your row gauge may vary slightly. I did not make you measure your row gauge because we can just measure the knitting. There is one reason you might want to knit quite a few more rows, more than 30. And that is if you want the look of a slouch hat. That's where it comes from, extra length. The other important thing is that a slouch hat not be a really tight hat, because it looks very strange if it is super tight around the ear area starts to come to a point like a cone head, and then there's a blob of extra knitting hanging off. Very peculiar, not anybody's favorite look. This hat is not tight like that, so you can make it a slouch hat simply by knitting extra length. So keep going round and round, whether one stitch at a time, one side at a time, or sometimes I wrap the entire round. It's a good time to practice not getting your yarn caught around the pegs, which is the bugaboo of new knitters, and we all get used to handling the yarn in such a way that it hardly ever happens. And a good time to experiment with methods and see what works for you. Oh, one more thing before I go, because it comes up sometimes. Look what happened. I am wrapping correctly, but by not handling this pair carefully enough, it split over the peg. When that happens, the knitting doesn't want to slide down for you. But the thing I was going to tell you is, I usually form my stitches by punching down and flipping over. That is not the only way to do it. Some people like to come up from the bottom and flip over. Is my way right and the other way wrong? Definitely not. If you get a stitch that looks good and it is not hurting your hand or wrist, and you are lifting the bottom loop over the top loop, you are knitting. There is no need to be concerned about exactly the method by which you achieve that. And the other thing is that whenever I use this hook, it gets questions. I do love this hook, and my husband made it for me and made a video showing you how you can make one yourself. And I will put a link to that video in the program notes. So, keep on knitting. Get to 8 to 9 inches of length or more if you're ambitious. And we'll go on to finishing the hat tomorrow. Here is my hat progressing. It's starting to pop out the bottom of the loom very noticeably. And here I am running out of the orange yarn, the darker one, and tying on the white yarn. I just use an ordinary knot and pull the tails through to the inside where they can be woven in or whip stitched into place with matching sewing thread later. And I'm going to knit this one to 8 inches, and I'm there. You can actually use a ruler to measure the knitting and see that you're close. If you are looking for written patterns, check out my Ravelry store. It's at the link pictured here. I will see you tomorrow when we'll finish the hat.